From the National Pharmaceutical Congress, this is the NPC podcast for April 28, 2021. The NPC podcast is all about discussing and considering the purpose, process and people of the pharma industry during the age of COVID. Today, we'll continue the healthcare conversation by answering questions from listeners like you. The NPC podcast is presented in cooperation with Imprez. Imprez best-in-class commercial solutions offer top-line and bottom-line growth, with maximum sales force flexibility, speed and efficiency. Learn more about their next-generation commercial model at www.imprez.com. On today's podcast, our guest is Josh Neiman. He's Senior VP and Chief Commercial Officer for North America and Europe of BeiGene. Your host today from our studio in Toronto is Peter Brenders. But first, here's Mitch Shannon of Chronicle Companies.
Hey Leona, nice to have you back for our 4th season of podcasts, but you don't sound like your old self.
To be honest, my throat's feeling a little rough. I think it's because I got my first vaccination shot yesterday.
When's the next jab scheduled?
The next shot is scheduled in 14 weeks. Well, finally, this summer we'll be able at least to get together for a drink.
And how I look forward to that. But first we have a bunch of podcasts to do. We're starting our new series with what John Cleese used to call something completely different. You've probably heard of beige. It's a color many regard as actually kind of boring. But you're going to be hearing a lot more about BeiGene, which is a pharma company operating in the oncology space. And there's nothing at all boring going on there. That's the word from Peter's guest today, Josh Neiman of BeiGene. Here's Josh in conversation with Peter.
Welcome to the NPC podcast. I'm Peter Brenders, your host. In our continuing look at the purpose, process, and people in pharma in Canada, this opening episode for Season 4 takes a look at Canada from the outside. And in particular, we will talk with a senior executive of a global pharmaceutical company that wants to bring their products to Canadians. Joining us today from San Mateo, California is Josh Neiman, Senior Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer, North America and Europe for BeiGene Limited. Welcome to the NPC podcast, Josh.
Thanks, Peter. I really appreciate you having me on.
Okay, before I jump into the obvious question of why Canada, I think our listeners would like a little info on BeiGene, not to be confused with Beijing. So perhaps you can give us a little insight or background on your company.
Yeah, absolutely. So I imagine that, for most of your listening audience and for Canadians generally, BeiGene is a relatively new company. While we're just now entering Canada, company's actually been around for about 10 years. We celebrated our 10-year anniversary just last year in 2020. The company's roots actually are in China. It probably comes as no surprise. It was founded by John Euler and Xiaodong Wang back in 2010. Now, John was a serial entrepreneur. He had started a number of companies. At the time, he had just started a company in China that was a contract research organization, a CRO, focusing on identifying new molecules for development. And he was introduced to Xiaodong while he was in China. Now, if you're not familiar with Xiaodong, he's a world-renowned scientist, considered one of the fathers of apoptosis, did research here in the US at the University of Texas Southwestern for many, many years. And he had returned to China. And so John and Xiaodong, had both heard about each other from many other folks and were told, hey, you guys really need to meet. And one day they had the good fortune of actually meeting. And at the time, Xiaodong actually approached John and, laid out this vision for a biotech company and thought that John would be a phenomenal partner. And he wanted John to return with him to the US to start the company. And John said, I'm excited to do it. It sounds like a great idea, but we're going to do it in China. And the reason for that was John, based on his experience, had looked at all the investment that was flowing into China to shore up their research opportunities, build these world-leading cancer institutes, et cetera. And he just saw an opportunity to actually make a real meaningful change in the pace of development for drug discovery. What he was quite familiar with was, it takes over 10 years for drugs to typically meet a patient, from initial lead identification, but the cost is exorbitant. Running clinical trials is incredibly challenging. And what he saw in China was an opportunity to accelerate the development of drugs, not just for Chinese patients, but really for global patients. And so from the very beginning, BeiGene's inception, if you will, was founded around this principle of, can they leverage China to accelerate the pace of drugs for patients all around the world? And so that was the initial vision that led to the founding of the company. And at the time, they went after, not necessarily first-in-class molecules, but molecules that would lead to best-in-class outcomes. So can they improve on existing classes? Now, today, the company is moving into first-in-class as well. Our focus is on oncology. We're in a number of countries around the world, China, the US, now Canada, going into Europe. We're in Australia. Australia was actually the second country BeiGene moved into. So while our roots are in China, really is a global biotech, doing what we can to accelerate the development of drugs for patients globally. And perhaps most importantly, trying to get them to patients as quickly as we can, regardless of where they are. And really with a keen focus on developing drugs that are meaningful advances and are able to be more accessible. So that's BeiGene in a nutshell.
Okay, so what I'm hearing though is it's not your usual startup company story. So China first, and I get the rationale behind that is, where the money can make the most difference quickly in the space. But then you talked about going to Australia and then the US and then Canada and the world. And so help us understand sequencing. Like, what do you look at when you're thinking about which country next? Like, what criteria are you using to look at places and invest and bring that care to patients?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Australia, if you're not familiar with it, is actually a country that works very closely with biotech and pharma to open up clinical trials very, very rapidly. And so there was an opportunity in the Australian environment to actually get our trials open and enrolled. And so with this idea that we're going to accelerate the development of drugs and take advantage of every opportunity that we can, Australia actually is a phenomenal environment for early stage companies looking to get their clinical trial programs off and running. And they've been a tremendous partner for BeiGene generally and continue to be so today. And so, that was really how Australia became a key component of BeiGene's initial outreach. And then, of course, as you look to sort of building a global biotech, the US is home to a number of researchers. There's a lot of key talent on the research and development side here as well. And so the next logical place for the company to come from an R&D standpoint was the US. But there, I think our path begins to diverge perhaps a bit more from the traditional model, which is as we then look to other countries to sort of commercialize our drugs, most big pharma companies, right, they take a step back and they say, okay, where can we go that'll maximize our market opportunity? Where can we go that has the best opportunity for profitability? And while certainly profitability is important to us as a company, revenue is important, we're a business, what's equally important to us is getting our medicines to as many patients as we can, as quickly as we can. And so we like to talk about the fact that BeiGene is trying to get not just the typical 2 billion patients that are addressed, through the US, Europe, Canada, and perhaps, if you include China as well, but to go to 4 billion patients now globally, right? And so BeiGene is really focused on ensuring that we can reach 4 billion patients with our medicines. And what that requires us to do is just not pursue the typical path, but to figure out how can we get to all of these patients as quickly as we can, because patients are waiting. I mean, there are countries around the world that don't even have access to a PARP inhibitor today, despite the fact that many are approved and have broad access to other countries, because companies have just been loath to go there, because they can't make the numbers work. And for us, we start with the patient, and that's led us now to take some moves that I think other companies may not have pursued themselves.
You're listening to the NPC podcast. I'm Peter Brenders, your host. Okay, so let's bring it back to Canada then. So I hear the story of Australia, great partner, not something I often hear about with Canada, so that's not the reason to come here. I hear the US story in terms of great research, great market and size and interest in patients. So that not always sort of the story behind Canada. So how does Canada fit at the top of that list in terms of your first ex-China market to launch your product for a rare cancer, for Waldenstrom's? Like, help me understand that.
Some of the credit goes to Canada, a lot of it, if you will. We've filed Waldenstrom's in a number of countries to date. Health Canada was the first country to actually get through the assessment and lead to the approval. And if you're not familiar with the study that led to this initial approval in Canada, it's based off the Aspen trial, which was a phase 3 head-to-head study of our BTK inhibitor, zanubrutinib, versus standard of care BTK inhibitor, ibrutinib. And, the study was one of the largest ever conducted in Waldenstrom's, if not the largest. And when we filed, we felt really confident about the data. The outcomes were a clear win for patients with Waldenstrom's. And what we found in working with Health Canada is, they were very thoughtful in their assessment of the data, but ultimately, I think that they saw what we saw. And it's that this is an option that needs to be made available for patients. And fortunately, the filing was fast-tracked and led to a very speedy approval. And so we're in this interesting situation now where we were committed to commercializing in Canada as quickly as we can. And lo and behold, we're in the very fortunate spot where Canadian patients, are now able to hopefully access zanubrutinib now. Of course, there's a lot more to do to ensure that there's broad access within the country, but Health Canada did their part. Now the drug is available.
Okay, so let's talk about sort of Canada compared to some other countries. So I hear your thoughts on Health Canada, but how would you say, in the view of the senior team at BeiGene, how do you think Canada compares to other countries like those in Europe, for example?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a great question. I mean, I think certainly Canada is much more similar to Europe than it is to the US, both in terms of the way it operates and in terms of the evaluation of drugs that are filed there and ultimately reimbursement, and even with the role that the various provinces play in ultimately deciding whether or not patients get access to initial therapy. I think one of the open questions for us, and one of the things that was a debate, is okay, we think we have a really strong clinical profile. There's a clear outcome here that will stand to benefit patients. But what's the probability that it's actually going to get covered and reimbursed? There have been examples where drugs that appear to have meaningful advances for patients ultimately don't get reimbursed, or companies that are thinking about going to Canada decide not to for fear that that's not going to happen. And so I do think that there's a bit of a difference when you look at the way that Canada evaluates medicines and ultimately decides whether or not they should be paid for. That is a bit slower, I'd say, than what you'd encounter in a country like Germany, right? Germany has a very rigorous assessment in terms of how they reimburse and for how much, but they're very focused on taking an approval and making that lead to immediate access for patients. I mean, if the health authority has decided that it's a clinical advance that warrants access for patients in Germany, it's available the very next day. I think in contrast to a place like Canada, as that while there are private markets that offer the opportunity, there are a minority of patients who can access those. And so really the open question for us is just how long is it going to take for us to get reimbursement and be able to provide a drug that we think is a meaningful advance, that Health Canada agrees is a meaningful advance for patients. Just how long is it going to take for us to be able to really maximize the number of patients who will be able to access it?
So that must really challenge sort of the philosophy of the company then. I mean, I look at the tagline, cancer has no borders, neither do we. But as you just mentioned, like different countries, different borders present different challenges. It must be quite the discussion. I'd appreciate understanding a little bit more sort of that senior level discussion, understanding that in some markets where the systems will pick up their patients and look after them quickly, in some markets they won't. Like, does that affect your priority setting?
Just going back to the earlier point, we do start with how can we get our medicines to patients as quickly as we can. Now, certainly the priority setting comes into play with how complex is that going to be. And so, we need to start earlier in places that are going to be more complex. But if we can get our medicine to patients quicker in one country, not because of the profitability associated with it, but just because the government is going to move more quickly to provide access, that might certainly affect that prioritization. But, if you ask anyone that works at BeiGene today, what you're going to find is we're trying to get our medicines to all patients as fast as we can. You've seen it in our public disclosures for where we filed. There are other filings underway. And so it is a constant source of discussion, but we have an employee base, an executive team that is committed, not just to having these be words, but words that are followed by action. And so today we are really focused on getting our medicines everywhere as we can. And Canada now really represents for us a phenomenal opportunity because we see a real strong clinical benefit for zanubrutinib today. In Waldenstrom's, we anticipate that our other studies in other malignancies will also confer similar results. And so for us, hopefully this is the beginning of what we anticipate will be a very long relationship with the Canadian government and most importantly with Canadian patients.
You're listening to Josh Neiman, Chief Commercial Officer for BeiGene. So it'll come as no surprise to our listeners that I've spent a little bit of time reading more on BeiGene and its founders and its approach to care. And I reflect on sort of John Euler and Xiaodong Wang's vision to create something meaningful. And it's funny, it reminds me of Henry Tamir at Genzyme some 30 years ago as he pioneered treatments for rare diseases in terms of something meaningful, something different. What do you think the BeiGene vision today is for growth? Tell me what that future is looking like.
Certainly. So what you have likely discovered in your assessment of us is, BeiGene has a very strong commitment and real investment in developing and discovering medicines that are meaningful advances. And so, it's perhaps a bit cliche to take a company like Genentech as example, and sort of say, you want to be the next Genentech? BeiGene wants to be more than that, I think. Genentech defined itself by showing that they could really advance the science, right? Be science forward and make really meaningful advances across a number of disease areas. We absolutely want to do that. And I think that the and part comes into play with, again, the keen focus on ensuring that patients globally have access. It's not enough to simply focus on the biggest markets. Cancer does not discriminate. Back to the earlier question, when we say cancer has no borders, neither do we, that speaks to our ambition and to the fact that there are patients around the globe. Their countries have theoretical borders. They're not physical borders, or perhaps in some cases they are, but the disease blows right through those. And, we would like to blow through them as well in terms of providing access. And so that's something that I think, every employee really feels and believes. And it's that commitment, to get to 4 billion patients if we can. And of course, 4 billion is the ultimate. I hope 4 billion patients don't need our drugs. That would mean that 4 billion individuals are actually suffering from cancer. But at least if any of those individuals, should have the unfortunate circumstance where they find themselves needing a medicine to treat their disease, our hope is that we will be there for them.
Okay, well, let me selfishly ask then, so what does the future hold for BeiGene's presence in Canada? Where do you see the corporate investment in our country?
Yeah, again, I go back to the point around, it's a long-term relationship. It's a real investment. And I think you can look at the way that we've approached the market and the way that we've resourced it as evidence of that commitment. As you mentioned earlier, we're already there very, very early on in our commercialization efforts. But beyond that, we've been really thoughtful about, trying to establish our Canadian presence with Canadians. Right? I think a lot of other companies will look at Canada as an opportunity to sort of provide headquarter, a talent with, hey, get some experience in a foreign market. That's not our approach. BeiGene's approach is to go to local markets and build affiliates based with local expertise because we intend to be there for the long run. As we look to BeiGene's presence in Canada today, obviously we have one drug that's been approved. We have a very robust pipeline with other molecules that are under development, constantly looking to in-license other molecules as well. And so I think 5 to 10 years from now, you're going to see that BeiGene is a strong partner for Canadian patients in the fight against cancer. And it's not going to be just one drug. It'll hopefully be many, many more.
You've been listening to Josh Neiman, Chief Commercial Officer of BeiGene Limited on the NPC podcast. Thank you for listening.
Thanks to Josh and Peter. If you want to know more about the company, check out BeiGene.com. And if you have comments or questions about the discussion you just heard, we've got lots of ways for you to connect with us. You can direct message us on Twitter at 2020NPC. That's easy. You can send an email to health@chronicle.org or, better yet, attach a voice clip and we'll use your voice in a future episode. You can also grab your phone and call our comment line at 647-873-6995. Like I said, lots of ways to connect with the NPC podcast. Listeners, why not join the 200 delegates who have already registered for the National Pharma Congress Spring Webinar on May 12th. We're featuring Brian Heath of Amgen, Marissa Poole of Sanofi, and Eileen McMahon of Tories. Ben Perry of Pangea is the moderator, and I will be your host on the theme of navigating pharma's post-COVID roadmap. Registration's free, but space is limited. So sign up now at www.pharmacongress.info. If you liked today's podcast, tell your colleagues about it. It's on Google Podcasts, Apple iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. The NPC podcast was presented in cooperation with Imprez, Canada's next generation commercial partner. Visit them at www.imprez.com. This is Mitch Shannon of Chronicle Companies here in Toronto. The producer is Jeremy Visser. Our announcer is Leona Ford. The musical theme is performed by the NPC Podcast Orchestra under the direction of Maestro Wilhelm Milbrook. Stay safe. We'll talk again next week.